we're going to spend some time talking about the human mind, and I describe the human mind as, for me, the greatest and the third big mystery of the universe. So we start with existence, the emergence of something from nothing, life, the emergence of being from existence, and mind, the emergence of our mental experience from life. And I said that, of course, it is through mind that we come to understand everything, and in fact, understanding the nature of the human mind helps us understand also how it can filter, sometimes help, and sometimes challenge our understanding of things around us. So through the mind, we come to understand and explore and understand what we know about the origins and the laws of the universe, the nature of our physical and life sciences, and ultimately, hopefully, also understand the nature of mind itself. The science of the mind is at a very different point in its development compared to sciences of the physical and life sciences matters. Physical and life sciences have developed over hundreds of years, and they have moved beyond intuitive explanations such as the centrality of the earth, for example, in the universe. And they have instead embraced an objective measurement approach to understanding reality. It went through a fabulous scientific revolution where, through very careful measurement and quantification, we were able to derive many sensible, logical, and rational laws about how the world behaves. But it didn't stop there. Those sciences were able to move beyond what's just intuitive to us, to embrace sometimes more unintuitive but very powerful explanatory approaches, so for example relativity, and have even developed some paradigms which frankly defy any of our ability to understand these on an intuitive basis, such as quantum mechanics. The science of the mind, compared to the physical and life sciences, is much, much younger, and I would argue that we are still in the adolescence of our own scientific revolution. We're somewhere still between the intuitive and trying to quantify and measure to obtain some of those sensible laws. And as things progress, my intuition is that things are going to become much more interesting and much stranger. The science of the mind really started in earnest in the late 1800s, where a few very courageous scientists broke with the dogma at the time and embraced the scientific study of the mind. Many people back then thought that this could not be done or should not be done because of the subjective nature of mind. Other people just probably thought it was too difficult, and why not do something much simpler, like trying to understand the origins of the universe, for example. So these intrepid individuals realized that indeed the subjective nature of the mind means that you cannot study it directly, at least not so far. But they understood that we could triangulate the workings of the mind by understanding behavior and how it changes systematically with changes in the world, and by understanding brain and how brain lesions and activity correlate with behavior. So we have, for example, in the late 1800s, pioneers like Francisco Donders from the Netherlands, and who was an experimental psychologist, and he built a machine. Of course, at that time there were no computers or iPhones and things for people to use to study, so they built ingenious, beautiful machines to time the time of thought. And he did this by asking people to make different judgments about stimulation just to perceive something, to discriminate something from something else, to choose between things, to respond to one thing with one hand or another thing with another hand. And by doing all these very systematic manipulations, and by using his Nemo tachograph, the machine to measure the time of thought, he could then start understanding how these building blocks of mental functions came together. So he was part of a big movement. There were also many other amazing scientists at the time, most of them men, of course, during that time. At the same time, there was another group of explorers who were the medics, who were observing relationships between patterns of damage in the brain and problems of high-level psychological functions. So, for example, language. And here I've illustrated the brain of Monsieur Le Borgne, who was a patient seen by a famous neurologist in Paris, Paul Broca. And he noted this lesion in Monsieur Le Borgne's brain and correlated it with the inability of this patient to produce language, even though he could understand language perfectly well. So we have some great roots in the late 1800s, but really the science of the human mind took off. Well, the modern era started in 1960s, and then the sort of contemporary era really took off in 1990s, where we've had an amazing series of developments of technology which have enabled us to measure activity in the healthy human brain of healthy individuals behaving as they're doing tasks, and also recording brain activity in people, and also being able to stimulate and interfere with ongoing activity in the brain. And I have had the amazing fortune not only to exist and be alive and have mental experience, but to have been at a stage in my life where I could enjoy this new science at the time. So I was sort of doing my doctorate in the early 1990s, and so my career has kind of followed this amazing explosion of human neuroscience. And it is really difficult for me to convey to anyone sort of the joy, the amazement of being able to be part of this collective pioneering spirit and seeing the doors to research open, and us being able to ask new questions about some very old fundamental things that we've always been curious about in new ways. So, even now in our very young adolescent time of our science, I would argue that we're already learning that the mind is not as intuitive as we think. And this is what I want to sort of try to give you some examples and a flavor to you today. So, as I mentioned, we have a sense, the mind is our portal to everything, and we have the sensation that we are continuous and that we experience all, that we sense all of reality around us as it unfolds. But actually, objectively, the truth is very different. So, compared to some animals, well, first of all, we pick up very few signals that are out there in the world. And compared to some animals, we pick up less signals than they do. So, for example, compared to the bumblebee, we don't have sensors to sense electrical fields. And also the electric fish, for example, have sensors for picking up electrical fields. We don't perceive those directly. It's not part of our conscious perception. And even within vision, we only pick up a very narrow slab of the electromagnetic field. So, for example, compared to the rattlesnake, we don't perceive an infrared, and compared to some butterflies, we don't perceive an ultraviolet, and we don't perceive X-rays, microwaves, gamma rays, none of those things. So we are actually experiencing a very narrow selection of signals that are out there in the world. And if we stick to vision, if we think about how vision unfolds in our brain, photons of light activate cells at the very back of our eyeballs, of our retinas. So vision starts with a bunch of little dots. And these little dots of light are put together into bigger dots of light, little line segments, patterns of motion, shapes, some colors. But all of this does not proceed through a nice, orderly reassembly of things in a systematic way. And instead, many of these features of our world are being extracted in parallel concurrently. And actually how the brain puts everything together to stitch, to patch together, to create a visual reality is still not understood very well. And in the field we know this as the binding problem, or the problem of binding things back together, putting things back together. And again, we have this, somehow out of this stimulation we create this coherent sense of visual experience. But if you think about it, if we think that our vision happens coming through our eyes, and we think about the nature of what goes on, what actually we take in is a little bit more like something like this. So our eyes fixate at different points. We have a small focal area. The rest of it is a bit blurry. The focal area is more sensitive to color and perceives things more granularly with greater detail. But our eyes move about 4 times a second, and occasionally we blink. So our vision really comes together with something more like this going on, where we're picking up little things, moving our eyes around, occasionally blinking, losing. So it's a discontinuous and very focal kind of pickup of the world, from which ultimately we then are able to sort of generate the perception, what we experience mentally. There are many examples of, what this means is that our perception is not so all-encompassing as we feel it that it is. And so people often have emphasized that this means that our perception is very limited. And there are many examples, and I'm sure if you've ever taken a psychology course, or if a friend of yours has, they might have told you about some amazing videos that you can look online about the invisible gorilla, change blindness, inattentional blindness. There are many, many demonstrations that show us how amazingly unaware we are of things that are changing right before our eyes. I chose one example that I think is quite a good one, which is just from the web, from an advertisement for a car. So the translator probably doesn't need to translate this part of the talk, but I'm going to show you just for your enjoyment. So the idea is there's going to be an advertisement for the car, and they're asking you to pay attention to the cool features of this car, and etc. So go for it.
To test just how much attention the attention-stealing design of the new Skoda Fabia actually steals, we left one parked on this ordinary road in West London. We wanted to see if its sharp crystalline shapes, bold lines, and lower, wider profile would attract the desired level of attention. Will the 17-inch black alloy wheels stop passers-by in their tracks? Will the angular headlights attract the attention of other road users? Will a crowd gather to check out its fresh, sporty look? Well, not quite. But did the attention-stealing design distract you from noticing that the entire street has been changing right before your very eyes? Don't believe us? Have another look. Did you spot the van changing to a taxi? How about the scooter changing to a pair of bicycles? Or the lady holding a pig? Let alone the fact that the entire street is now completely different. Didn't think so.
Okay, so this is true. It feels uncomfortable, but it's true. But sometimes these demonstrations, they sort of live a little bit in the, oh, this is so interesting. But because we have this phenomenology, this sense of our perception as being real, we never actually consider how these, let's not call them limitations, but how these features of our perception actually influence how we behave in complex, demanding, loud, stimulating environments. So for example, a school classroom of a small child. They're picking up one thing at a time. They're not picking up everything that's going on at the same time. Or situations that are really demand us being able to manage the information at hand. So for example, we've done a study looking at the perception of individuals in resuscitation in a hospital setting, like resuscitation of patients, for example. And we ran like an experiment where we created a video where we changed aspects that are happening within a simulation of a resuscitation, and to study, the extent to which doctors, experts in resuscitation actually can cope with all the information that's taking place in a typical resuscitation situation. So I'll show you the video that we ran, and then I'll explain to you what we did. But first I'll tell you what we did just broadly. So we had this video, we made some changes in it. Some of them are fun but trivial, wouldn't matter if those things happen in real life. Some of them are more significant and might have been clinically relevant, one of which would have killed the person if it had happened in the real life. So, it goes from the trivial to the fundamental. And we asked different expert groups, novices, young medical students, more experienced doctors, and super experts, who are people who actually involve and train people in resuscitation situations. And we asked them to watch this short video, pay close attention, and then be able to talk us through if there were anything wrong or how well the procedures were being carried out. And then we asked them about some of these changes that we made. So it's a very short video, and here it is.
29, 30.
Okay, that's 2 minutes. Can we do a rhythm check? That's a shockable rhythm. Rosie, can I hand over to you, please?
Okay, Martin, can you give me chest pressure, please? We're going to charge on the test. Alex, get rid of the oxygen, please. Okay, charging at 150. Okay, Martin, stand back, please. Rocky, 150, everybody clear. Back in the test, please continue giving oxygen.
Good, can I do a drum?
Okay, so maybe some of you noticed some things were shifty in this video, maybe not, maybe it seemed completely normal to you. So here we introduced 5 changes in this video. And we asked, so first we debriefed people about how did the procedure go and stuff, and then we asked them about these 5 changes, but we also asked them about other changes which we did not make as a control. So we wanted to see if which ones they could tell had really happened in this video or not. And the 3, so here they are. So some of them are silly. So number 1 is the hat of the woman changes from blue to green. Number 2 is a stethoscope that wasn't there before, is now changed. Number 3 is the person who was giving the resuscitation changed. Number 4, the airway device changes, and now we're starting to get things that are relevant to the resuscitation procedure. And finally, number 5, which I know that our dubber did notice, because I saw her signaling to the people who are deaf. This oxygen goes off and gets disconnected and makes a sound halfway through the resuscitation. And the numbers there are the percentage of medical students, doctors, and expert anesthesiologists who noticed those changes. And there are some, you can say there's some good things, like the more important the changes, like the oxygen compared to the hat, more people realize that. And the super experts are a little bit better than the medical students. But the really shocking numbers are that only 30% of the super experts notice something that would kill the person. So these are, the way our perception works matters. And we should acknowledge that, we are not all experiencing as we think we are. We have a very selective interface that we need to understand the principles of in order to design procedures, schools, interfaces, advertisement, whatever we want to do. But often, what we focus on is never about the basic perception. We focus on people are not making the right decisions, they're not considering the right facts. They don't actually look at the really, really basic things that also really matter. So by now you might be feeling like, oh, this is really awful. You know, I'm feeling like here I was all experiencing, now I'm feeling like I don't experience anything and I have a rubbish, bad sort of perceptual system. And I'll argue to you that this is not true. Our perceptual system is wonderful, but it is adapted. It is adapted to the demands that we have evolved in and that we have kind of grown up and learned and experienced life through. So I'm going to give you now a counterpoint, a different kind of example, which shows how amazing our perceptual system is. So I'm going to give you an impossible task. I'm going to ask you to look at a bunch of figures that are going to flash through super quickly. And I just want you to sort of pay attention and see whether you think there's a car, a vehicle, a car in any of these pictures. Okay, so here we go. You could do this, right? Almost no designed intelligent system that we can put together has that amazing capacity. You know what you're looking for now. You're looking for cars. You don't know what size they are, how big they are, where they are on the screen, but somehow you're ready for this. You can focus and extract information from very complex situations and pick up what you need to follow your goals. So this is the counterpoint, that our perception is not that it's limited, it is highly, highly focused and adapted to pick up things in our environment. So I'm going to illustrate the case with stargazing, for example. So if you're out in a beautiful sky in the night, our vision in this kind of situation, you know, there's just a lot of dots, nothing very structured here necessarily. Our vision will be caught by different things. One, those things that our brains have evolved to pick up well. Those things that are important to us or might be important to us. And those are things that are fast, bright, moving, loud. So you might pick up the shooting star in a sky like this, if you have a big shooting star. But you can also purposefully, through your willpower, decide to look for certain objects that are relevant to you. You might want to be identifying a new star like Mintaka. And the other thing that your perception is adapted to is not just what it's learned through evolution, but it's what it's learned through your lifetime. Your experiences, all the memories you have formed, have sculpted your brain and have told it like what are the things that are relevant and have meaning and things, and those things are fundamental building blocks in the perceptual system. So for example, if you're looking for Mintaka, you might maybe realize that it's part of the, in Portuguese, like Três Marias, or Las Três Marias, or the Orion's belt. And if maybe you're a real stargazer, I know there are some people here, you might kind of recognize broader constellation of Orion himself. So it is the case that, you know, we piece together our perception and we can use salient things that evolution has taught us and our memories, and we can volitionally, through our own will, interact with a scene to pick up what's relevant to us at any given time. So this is this very well-behaved group, which is my lab, my research group, usually on a barbecue outside our lab. And so if you're in a situation like this, I'm speaking to someone, I'm paying attention to them visually, but my mind is also wandering to like, is the food ready? Where's the beer? And what the heck is my husband doing out in the corner there? Even though the whole time it's just my mind is moving around, but I'm actually focusing on the person at hand. So we can use our goals, our interests at any given time to sort of sample other bits of the world in addition to where our senses are pointing. And furthermore, this ability that we have to focus and to pick up relevant information is not something that the brain does just reactively. We tend to think that perception is the result of outside world stimulating our senses, rebuilding things, and then us reacting to things. But the whole time, your brain is active, it's predicting what's going to happen, and it predicts what's going to happen dynamically, in a temporally structured way, in space and in time and in content. So I'll just give you one example of sometimes, so if you think about it like in extreme sports, for example, if you're in a tennis match, there is no time for you to be reactive. Your brain needs to be proactive, and you need to be anticipating things all the time. And this is what the brain does all the time. It's always anticipating things that are going to happen. So here's a kind of a nice example. It's a horrible video, but it's low quality. And this is Neymar, a Brazilian football player who is, sometimes a little bit cheeky, doesn't always play by the book. So he's here, he's just suffered a penalty, as he does. And then watch what he does. He gets ready, he runs to one direction, and there's no chance that the goalie can get this, right? This is the paradinha in Portuguese. And so obviously after this, even FIFA has agreed that this is not legal. You can't do this in a game. But what he's playing with here is the ability that actually, yes, the brain is anticipating that ball is going to come to that upper right corner, and that's where the goalie has to jump. And, so obviously he's been playing tricks on this, but that's what our brain is doing all the time. Hopefully there are not a lot of Neymar out in the world interacting with us, and most of the time our brain gets it right. So we're able to interact with a very dynamic world super efficiently. When we have a goal, we know what's important to us, and we can predict what's going to happen before. So I'm not going to give you any sort of real scientific examples of how we go about studying this in the brain, but I thought I would give you one example just so you think I'm not just talking about stuff, but that we actually have a whole science behind a lot of this work. And I'm going to give you an example of a study that I did with many of my favorite students, Gustavo Rowencol, who's from Brazil and was doing his PhD with me at Oxford at the time. And we take these complex problems like this and we simplify them into tractable things that we can measure very carefully in people. So in this case, we have people looking at a display on a computer. There's a little fixation point, and people have to keep their eye fixed on that fixation point all the time. And then there's a ball that appears and just moves across the screen like this. So they're looking at the fixation cross, the ball's moving, it disappears behind an occluding band, and then it reappears again. Here I drew the ball as if you could see it through the occluder, but you cannot see it through the occluder. And we had different conditions. So this one, where the timing and the location is entirely predictable. If the brain is able to use this information, it can anticipate accurately where and when that target is going to happen. Then we had other conditions where the ball was still moving in a straight line, but the timing was all wrong, so the brain could not anticipate when it was going to happen. And when we do these experiments, we can measure what's happening in a person's head, in a person's brain, just by, for example, in this case, just putting electrodes outside and measuring populations of cells active at any given time in the brain through this method of EEG, or electroencephalogram. And what we see is that during the time of the occluder, this thing doesn't work, so you have a ball and then an invisible jump, and then the ball comes out again. During the time where nothing is happening, there's nothing happening on the screen, there's just a scene with an occlusion, there's no balls, but the brain, the excitability of the visual cortex, which we can measure through the own rhythm of the visual cortex, which happens between 8 and 12 hertz, those blobs there, the excitability of the visual cortex is going up and down, as if it's actually perceiving and anticipating something that's happening. Even though there's nothing on the screen, but this prepares the brain for when that target happens, it's in the perfect situation to do its job of perceiving that really, really well. So we can watch the brain dynamically in time, millisecond to millisecond, anticipating the future and reality. So that's just to give you a flavor of the types of experiments that we do to study some of these things. And I think I speak on Monday to the science faculty, and I'll go through more experimental work there. So we have this ability to direct focus of attention, purely mental ability. We can move our attention around independently of how we move our sensors and our eyes. And how do we do that? So one outdated, old, but very, very difficult to abandon idea is that was proposed by the phrenologists in the early 1800s. And this is the idea that we have specific brain areas that are responsible for specific functions, like, you have memory in this area and fear in this area. And even though this is an outdated idea now, as I mentioned, you still see echoes of this idea, even in some of our best journals and research publications in the field. Phrenology is wrong. We don't have organs in the brain for doing specific jobs. But the areas of the brain, they have their own specializations according to who they're talking to, who's sending signals to them, the exact ways that, the cells within regions are transforming signals. So they have their specializations, and these come together in networks to support psychological and cognitive functions. And these are very flexible and adaptive networks. And interestingly and amazingly, I would say, is if you look at the network that is responsible for controlling the actual eye movements in the world, this is the one here on the left, and the network that's involved in controlling how you move attention around in the world without moving your eyes, they look very similar. And this suggests that what happens is that mental functions, like attention, they actually work by building on and adapting and evolving simpler networks that have existed there before. So this gives us a very strong evolutionary idea of how mental functions come to be organized in the brain. So in the final talk, I'll just tell you a little bit about how over recent years in my laboratory, we've also been interested in how we can deploy or focus attention inside our minds as well. So we have been studying how, first of all, whether, and then having learned that we can do this, how we can actually select which of the things that are in our mind right now are most important to us, and whether we can focus on them, turn them up, and turn the other ones down as we go about our function. And we've discovered that even in the case of attending inside your mind, there's also a very close relationship to the areas in the brain that do this, and the mechanisms by which we do this, and the mechanisms of controlling eye movements themselves. So in fact, if you're in my laboratory and I'm running an experiment or a study on you, and I'm manipulating where you're focusing inside your head, I can tell what you're thinking about just by measuring your eyes. So I'll give you an example. Let's say, morning, making coffee. This is my kitchen counter. Always good to have some chili peppers in the morning. And I'm about to make some coffee. Usually Luciano makes coffee in the house and he's already looking at me like, you making coffee? Never. Sometimes, if on a bad day I have to make coffee, I might have some coffee here on the right, some sugar on the left. I turn away to get the coffee machine. I can't see my counter anymore. It's gone. I'm looking another place, but this counter exists in my head. I'm going to illustrate it just like a fuzzy picture like this. Okay? And as we have this situation, I measure your eyes, and we can sort of say, like, if you're orienting attention to one thing or the other, as I said, we can see that effect in your eyes. So for example, if you focus the attention on the coffee in your mind, there's no coffee that you're looking at, it's only in your head. What we'll measure is that there are tiny, tiny, automatic, unconscious eye movements that the eye makes to the right, as if it's looking at that coffee inside your head. You cannot control these types of movements voluntarily. They just happen. So these are called microsaccades, very small eye movements that happen to the eye. So that's amazing. But even more amazing thing is that the pupil of your eye adjusts to the brightness of the item in your mind. So this is coffee. Coffee is dark. So as you focus on coffee, when we measure your eyes, we see your pupils expand. Okay, so now, you've gotten your coffee, your machine, now you're focused on the sugar. The sugar's on the left. You get tiny eye movements on the left, and your pupil constricts, shrinks. Amazing, right? So this suggests that, we have built these evolutionary mechanisms also to interact with our mental experiences. They are kind of really scaffolded by some of these simpler methods. So this is all of the examples I wanted to give you today. I hope that, I've kind of shared with you the fun of being involved in a young science like the science of the mind, and how even in this early adolescence we can see that the mind maybe is a little bit less intuitive than we would imagine. Our pickup from the world starts with this very focused and discontinuous pickup from which we sort of build a perceptual system. This perceptual image or experience that we build has its own interesting properties. On the one hand, it's very focal, which people like to think of as a limitation. On the other hand, it's amazingly adapted to interact with things that are important and relevant to us in an extremely fast and flexible and efficient way. And we can see that these mental functions, they build on simpler functions in the brain, sort of building through evolutionary adaptations. And and we can sort of use these things also to measure how our minds are, what they're picking up and how they're adapting to the world from a millisecond to millisecond basis. So, that's some of the findings that I wanted to share with you today. And just to say, I'm doing this very aware that maybe all of this that I've told you is very still naive. And I hope that in 50 years, 20 years, maybe if people continue loving science the way I do, we will have a much deeper and much more bizarre explanation of how this all works. But for now, thank you very much.